Today, I'm joined by Christoffer Hentzer Dausgaard, a postdoctoral researcher in political science at the University of Copenhagen. We're going to talk about his recent American Journal of Political Science paper titled You and Whose Economy, on how voters judge the economy through the lens of their own social group. So, Christoffer, to start, could you talk a little bit about your background and the research you do in general?
Yeah, thank you. So I do research on political behavior in general. I finished my PhD a few months ago, and my broader sort of interest in that dissertation was on how voters use their social group memberships to make sense of politics. So politics is awfully complex, and few people follow it closely or closely enough to understand everything that's going on. So I see social groups as this sort of amazing simplifying device that allows voters to make pretty good decisions, I think, in politics without understanding everything.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And certainly, as much as we all want to be fully informed about the ramifications of every political issue, I think we all need a way to simplify at the end of the day. So it sounds like a really important and impactful thing to be studying. So with that, you've had a recent publication that uses Verasight data called You and Whose Economy. And so would love to dive into that a little bit more. So what was the research question behind You and Whose Economy, and what drew you to studying how people read the economy through their own group?
Yeah, so the research question of this paper is basically to explore this sort of social group lens on politics applied to a very predominant theory in political behavior, the theory of retrospective voting or economic voting, which is sort of a very influential idea that when deciding how to vote, voters typically look back on how things have been going in the past sort of few years under the government, and they then make a decision on whether they want to keep the incumbent in power or they want a change of party or a change of hands. And so the research question here is basically, do voters evaluate the economy and how things have been going through the lens of their social groups? And this question arose out of, I think, kind of a tension I think there is in the existing literature, in that it's very well documented that the economy matters a huge deal. Like voters really do engage in this type of retrospective voting. But a sort of big question has been what parts of the economy they care about. And most research up until now suggests that voters just care about the national economy, right? So they generally don't look too much to their own personal conditions, but mostly just look at sort of overall GDP, the unemployment rate, overall inflation, and so on. So that's what we call sociotropic voting, just looking at sort of national indicators. And that's a sensible thing to do, I think. But at the same time, there's something I think puzzling about the idea that this is all that voters care about when it comes to the economy. Because first of all, the economy consists of many sort of conflicting interests, right? The overall sort of national growth can hide a lot of sort of subnational variation, right? And subnational trends that go in very different directions. And different governments clearly align with sort of the interests of different groups in society. So the idea that voters just should care about the average is a little odd. And at the same time, there's a lot of research suggesting that voters tend to think in these group terms when it comes to a lot of aspects of politics. So I think there's something there's telling me that we need to sort of reconcile these perspectives. It would make sense for voters to also evaluate the economy through the perspective of their own groups.
Very cool. And from my read of the paper, it sounds like you did, in fact, find that people do evaluate the economy through the context of their own groups. So could you dive into specifically what you found in the study?
Yeah. So yes, overall, there is pretty consistent evidence in the paper that voters do this. And I use two sort of empirical strategies or two sort of strands of evidence. The first is using observational survey data. So just sort of a big panel data set from the British election study. Lovely data set, lots of waves spaced over sort of 10 years. And here I just look at sort of within voter variation in perceptions of how different social groups are doing economically in society. They have these amazing variables on asking people, how do you think the working class has been doing over the past year? And how do you think people in your local community have been doing over the past year, and so on? And these closely mirror sort of typical sociotropic voting variables. So that's quite neat. And then I just look at sort of the within respondent relationship between changes in these perceptions for voters' own in-groups and then their support for the incumbent party. And in this observational analysis, I find that there's a pretty strong relationship between these two that rivals the relationship between the typical sociotropic variables. So already here it suggests that group-based retrospective voting might be about as strong as sociotropic retrospective voting. But it's not sort of fully decisive evidence. It may be, I think there might be reasons why those two things co-vary over time that are not causal, right? There might be third variables that affect both. And it might also be that existing incumbent supporters are favored more by the government. And so over time, the two things follow each other without voters actually responding to the conditions of their own in-group. And there are sort of other alternative mechanisms as well. So to really fully get at the causal evidence we need, I turn to some survey experiments. And the sort of the design, I run 3 sets of experiments, 2 in Denmark and then 1 in the US, using Verasight data, which was quite amazing to be able to replicate the Danish results in the US. And the design for all these experiments is pretty similar. It is that I provide respondents with some information about how a randomly chosen social group has been doing lately based on actual sort of survey results from a different survey. So I actually give them sort of real information. But then I randomly vary whether they receive this information about their own group or an outgroup. And the idea is then to compare these random allocations of groups and see if voters respond differently when they receive information about their own group versus a different group, holding everything else constant. And what I find is, again, that both in Denmark and the US, voters seem to respond substantially more to news about their in-group than about their out-groups, suggesting they do independently care about how their group is doing, even when you sort of hold constant how they're doing personally and how the national economy is going.
Fascinating. Thanks, Christoffer. And could you talk a little bit about how you defined in-groups? So what were the different demographics or other variables that you looked at?
Yeah. So for this, I looked at sort of classical, I think, canonical social groups in the literature, but only sort of a subset. I couldn't cover everything, but I did try to sort of cast a pretty wide net to get a sense of how general this pattern is. So in terms of the groups, I looked at age groups and class groups, and then geographical groups, both sort of regions and one's local community, and then education groups and ethnicity groups. And then in the US case, I specifically interacted education and ethnicity to get sort of crossed groups. So like Hispanics with a higher education, Hispanics without a higher education, whites with and without, blacks with and without, to sort of get more granular groups that I hypothesize should be more relevant because they sort of have a strong interest clustering. And the way I then allocate respondents to groups is just by asking them in the beginning of the survey, which of these groups would you say you belong to? I do that in 2 surveys. And in the 3rd survey, I just sort of allocate them myself based on their background characteristics to avoid sort of concerns that I'm sort of priming them with some group identities right before showing them some information to make sure that this is really something they sort of naturally care about.
Fascinating. And so could you dive a little bit more? You kind of alluded to some of the structure of the survey questions and the ordering, but could you speak in even a little bit more detail to the specific questions you asked to kind of get at how people identify with their own group?
Yeah, so for how people identify, I generally I show them just one sort of group category. So it could be age. And then I have, for instance, for age groups, I decided to go with sort of subjective age groups. So younger people, middle-aged people, and elderly people, sort of relatively sort of broad subjective categories. So people could pick the one that they thought was most fitting. And then I just asked them sort of, which of these do you feel closest to, or which of these do you feel like you belong to if you had to pick one? And then I have some sort of validation questions in one of the Danish surveys where I ask them about sort of more classical social identity questions, like how strong a sense of belonging they feel and so on. And this is not actually in the paper, but I do run some sort of moderation analyses to see whether these strength of identity things matter. And they don't seem to matter that much, actually. So the main measures are still sort of a simple binary, sort of, do you belong to this group or not, subjectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And then for evaluating how kind of each group or voters judge the economy, how did you kind of pose that question?
So do you mean in the experiments?
Yeah, in the experiments. Yep.
So in the experiments, I give them a vignette that basically says, on the one hand, the economy doesn't develop the same way for everyone, sort of setting the scene. And then it says, for example, in the latest survey from the Danish elections study, the proportion of working class people, for instance, feeling financially insecure increased and compared to the previous survey to give a sense of a trend. And then the second piece of information it gives is that it says, by comparison, the overall national average was unchanged or something like that. This varies a little bit between surveys, but that's the idea. And in some conditions, I withhold the national level statistic to see if they sort of respond to the relative group trend relative to the national average or just the group trend in itself. And it seems like it's the relative group trend that really drives this. But the national statistic is kept constant across all conditions otherwise. And then the way I sort of get that contrast while using sort of real survey data is that I just use slightly different items from this Danish election project survey. And the same with the ANES that I use for the American survey. So I get these contrasts by using one survey item where the sort of average response was very positive, and I cite that as a national number. And then I use a different survey item that's sort of slightly different and is much more pessimistic. And that helps me get sort of within this group, many people felt financially insecure, but at the same time, most people thought that they were doing fine economically. And it's not sort of, these are two different items, but there's enough of a contrast between them that I can sort of get this contrast for all groups, basically.
Got it. Thanks for diving into a little bit, Christopher. So yeah, thanks for going through your methodology and your findings. Yeah, super interesting. I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you think this means or why it matters, both for researchers and also outside of academia.
Yeah. So I think some of the main takeaways for me that I think both researchers who care about, but also the general public, is that first of all, these results suggest that there are sort of limits to sociotropic voting. It's kind of conditional whether how much voters care about the national economy, right? Because they might like that the national economy improves, but if their own group is sort of lagging behind, then that will sort of dampen their enthusiasm, right? Or their optimism. So I think this suggests that there's sort of more of it can explain why not everyone is happy when the national economy grows. And I think there's been quite a lot of also public sort of debate about, for instance, why many voters were unhappy with the Biden economy, despite sort of national numbers that are pretty good. And I think it's an important qualification to those debates that people might actually care about something else, which is a little more local and a little more close to themselves. I think it also matters for just how we should think of how sort of incumbents might manage the economy in ways that are sort of strategic. There's a big literature in political behavior, like how good are voters at sort of disciplining the incumbent to sort of steer the economy well. And I think the sociotropic voting picture is pretty optimistic on this because it suggests that people, since they care about the national averages, the incumbent has to do a pretty good job of sort of securing national growth and sort of overall growth and prosperity. But if voters care about their own groups, there is some more room for incumbents to be a little more strategic about who they target and who they help out. And that means that they can look a bit more away from the national average and care a little more about how things are distributed. And I think that is potentially worrying. And then I think more broadly, it kind of just matters for how we make sense of some contemporary political phenomena, like backlash to globalization or the green transition. I think there's a lot of research right now at the moment on how to manage globalization's losers, but also losers of the green transition, right? Or even losers of sort of the AI technological transition, or sort of digitalization of jobs. And one sort of way to do this, if you think that the problem is sort of individual economic grievances, is just giving people sort of individual cash compensation. So the people who are sort of hit by something, some sort of development, they can just get some like individual cash compensation. They should be happy, right? But I think this research suggests that people might care about something on a kind of a different level. Maybe what they care about is more that they feel like their group is being seen and their interests of their group are being sort of are seen and taken care of. So I think that suggests that individual level compensation might not be the thing we should go for, but something more sort of group level. And then I think more broadly, just that many studies and sort of conversations about what explains recent economic sort of electoral phenomena, I think this research suggests that economic variables may matter more, or the economy may matter more than many of these accounts suggest. Because if you just look at the national economy or personal sort of economic conditions, you might be missing this group layer that actually can explain, I think, more than we think. And it can easily be hidden in sort of classical economic analyses. So I think the economy may play a bigger role than we usually think in electoral phenomena.
Great. Thanks for sharing so many different angles. Lots to consider there for researchers and also for the general public and people concerned with politics, which should be everyone. And certainly the examples that you shared, Christopher, about the way that policy could potentially be targeted or optimized towards specific groups at the expense or without as much consideration to like overarching national strength or performance is something that I think anyone who's been paying attention to politics in the US, certainly as I have for the last decade or so, can see start to play out. So anecdotally, definitely resonates from my perspective as well. And from Verasight's perspective, right, I think it could be really interesting to take this kind of like in-group lens that you studied and think about it generally in the context of things like polling, because you often see like in the media, these very headline numbers. Okay, this candidate or this party is supported or not supported, but probably a lot more to explore kind of at that group level more often than I think we historically do as well in the media.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would love to see more measurements of perceptions of how groups are doing or how groups are benefiting from policies or sort of lose out, that kind of thing. I think you're totally right. That would be a great thing to track.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Christoffer. Maybe just to wrap up, would love your thoughts on what's next for this line of research. Like, do you have plans for follow-on research? Is there anything you'd like to see other researchers explore? So talk about that, and then also just how people can follow along with your work and this kind of work going forward.
Yeah, so I think the next steps for this are definitely looking more into things like which groups matter most for this. I had to sort of predefine groups that I thought were relevant, right? And then just look for evidence on those. But I think a more sort of comprehensive analysis of what makes some groups more relevant than others, and also sort of changing relevance of groups for this kind of thing is super important. And then I think also this question of what this means for like electoral accountability, like is this a bad thing? Because, as I mentioned, incumbents can sort of divide and rule a little bit. Or is it really something that also maybe ensures that growth doesn't become too unequal? Or sort of there are some built-in incentives to ensure that incumbents should make sure no one is sort of fully left behind. I think that's a really important question as well. And then I think also just more generally how voters understand sort of how well the government looks after the interests of their group, basically. Like, since groups matter so much, I think we need there's been a lot of research on like social identities, and I think we need to move more into looking at groups as sort of this useful heuristic that helps voters understand how incumbents govern. And I've also done some research myself. I'm currently doing some stuff on how governing rhetoric, the sort of incumbent parties' rhetoric towards groups, how that shapes perceptions and how good of a heuristic that is for understanding how they govern towards particular groups. So that's something I'm looking more at the moment. And yeah, I mean, you can follow my work on my website. Especially, I post sort of quite regularly there on my working papers and so on. So I'd recommend that.
Fantastic. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us and talk with me, Christoffer. Hopefully in a year or two, we can have a follow-up conversation about new literature and what else has been learned in this area, because it sounds like a really important area to continue studying going forward. So yeah, thanks, Christoffer.
I'd love that. Let's totally do that.
Cool.